The GPS DairyCast features the high-value insights of the GPS Dairy Consulting team's trusted advisors and the owners and managers from the elite dairy farms they serve. These conversations deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders.
Welcome to the GPS DairyCast. I'm your host, Peggy Coffeen from the Up-Level Dairy Podcast. And our conversation today is all about inflammation and in the way of stress management, but not for the dairy farmers themselves, but rather for the cows that you're taking care of. And we have three experts in this field to address this topic today. Two of our GPS consultants, Brady and Megan, as well as Dr. Lance Baumgard from Iowa State University, who has studied this extensively. So I'm going to turn this conversation over to the three of you. We're going to be walking through what inflammation actually is, how that shows up on the dairy, what the research has looked like around this topic, as well as some of the take-home strategies that dairy producers can put into effect to be able to better manage stress and inflammation on their dairies. Well, Dr. Baumgard, Brady, and Megan, welcome to the GPS DairyCast.
Glad to be here.
So to get this conversation rolling, I'm just going to throw out to the three of you to each take a swing at describing what inflammation actually is. Dr. Baumgard, would you like to start?
Both Megan and Brady probably know more about it than I do, but so inflammation, there's a couple different kinds. We call one of them sterile inflammation. This would be sterile. This would be inflammation associated with, for example, a headache or arthritis. And there's also another term called infectious or pathogenic inflammation. And this is inflammation stemming from immune activation. We probably all have familiarity with this. You have an infection, you have immune activation, and then, of course, there's inflammation stemming from that immune activation. So this is hard to measure, but on farm, it's typically emanates as decrease in feed intake, decrease in productivity, things that cost you money.
Yeah, when I'm talking to people that maybe don't have the background we do, I like to compare the immune system to an army going to war, right? So if you think of your immune system as the soldiers going to battle, we need to communicate that war's taking place, and inflammation is the way that your immune system talks to itself to let the body know that there's a foreign invader, pathogen, whatever that may be. So when we're talking about inflammation, we're really talking about the immune system being turned on to indicate to the body that we need to take care of the problem. So that's how I relate to inflammation, and we're going to do a deep dive into the consequences of that and things we should be looking for on farms. But that's oftentimes how I'm describing inflammation to the general public. So, Brady, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, I always use a splinter analogy, right? You get a splinter, that's the insult, that's the injury, that's the thing your body's going to try to fight. And inflammation is a response to that. So that's the red swelling you get, that's the pus you might get to try to remove that. So it's the response to the insult that you have.
You each have great analogies for better understanding what inflammation actually is in ways that we could think of it in our own human bodies. But as you said, this shows up in the stress that the cow is going to express, Dr. Baumgard, as lost milk production and other things that cost money. And so for you, Megan and Brady, what do you see as the negative impacts of inflammation from your seat as dairy consultants and nutritionists?
Yeah, I think the big one, and Lance hit it on the head earlier, it's how do you measure it and what does that mean? And it is a hard one to physically measure. We don't have just one metric that we says, oh, there, yep, now we have inflammation. So oftentimes it's subclinical. Is the reason why we have limited dry matter intake because we have inflammation going on? Or is milk production suffering because there is some inflammation going on? It's one of those tricky ones to try to help define and understand on farm, I think. And then maybe look in the transition period. Is that a reason why we have increased disease incidence? Is inflammation the chicken or the egg? And so it's all of those different situations that I think go into that.
I think to expand on what Brady said, it's important to understand that inflammation exists on a spectrum, right? There's a big difference between having an inflamed splinter and being septic in the hospital about to die. And all of that inflammation is a part of both of those scenarios. But there's an obvious difference in the outcome for that. So inflammation on dairies, when I'm walking farms, of course, we're very familiar with, and we have practices to intervene with those very severe circumstances, like cow going down with watery mastitis or the severe ketosis, et cetera. But when I'm thinking about stress and the implications of stress turning the immune system on through leaky gut, which I'm sure we're going to cover a little bit later, we're talking more about the level of inflammation that's going to be that next 2, 3, 5 pounds of milk. It's much less noticeable. It's a little more subclinical. And there's probably a lot of different factors that are leading to that loss in milk production. So like Brady and Lance have indicated, it's tricky to measure on farm. We don't have a great cow side metric. We can't just stick them with the ketosis meter when people are trying to measure ketosis, which we can talk about later, of course, why we think inflammation is a big driver of ketosis. But we don't have a great cow side way to measure inflammation. And oftentimes it's a little bit hidden because it's not acute. The cow is still eating, but maybe she could be eating better. And there's a lot of different factors that could be playing into that. So
when we get to really the diagnosis, so to say, of understanding, is the result we're seeing that lost production or some sort of challenge the cow is going through, anything that's less than her best, right? Is it inflammation at the root cause of that? And so, Dr. Baumgard, with some of the research that you've done in your department, what have you identified?
Well, it's a great question. And the little history here, we started working on heat stress when I was at the University of Arizona in 2005. And slowly over time, we whittle our way down to the gut. So heat stress causes gut health issues, particularly the barrier function of the gut. That was probably like 2017, 15, 16, actually even before that, it was in 13 and 14. And then we started to recognize that the consequences of this heat stress induced leaky gut is very similar from a metabolic, physiological, and inflammatory perspective to other stressors that a dairy cow may be experiencing, for example, off feed or in transition period. And this whole idea that stressors, essentially all stressors, negatively affect the gut, I think is starting to become more well accepted amongst stress physiologists. And so I guess that's what we've been working on at Iowa State, and Dr. Goetz and Dr. Abeyta were key in these experiments, demonstrating that these stressors, common ones that he's finding on the farm, high acidosis, the transition period, overcrowding, off-feed events, they all have essentially the same exact footprint. It's too similar to be a coincidence, right? So all these stressors emanate from the gut.
So what started out is really, like you said, some of the research you're doing in Arizona looking at heat stress really started to drill down into this area of gut health and some of the factors that were overlooked in the past. And so Megan and Brady, being involved in some of those projects and the findings yourself, what were you able to identify, or what have you taken away into your daily practice on the dairy for being able to hone in and say, yes, this is an inflammation issue that we're looking at?
I think the biggest thing is understanding all of the different, and I know we'll talk about it, but stacked stressors is the one thing that I bring up a lot, right? So a cow can handle calving just fine, but then you throw heat stress in there, or you throw overcrowding in there. So it's really understanding some of those situations. Certain times of the year we might have more fresh cow issues than others. And is that a dietary problem? As a nutritionist, that's where we often get, hey, is something happening in the ration that we got to get looked at here? And oftentimes the ration hasn't changed, or there's minor tweaks that may have occurred, but that's likely not the culprit of what's going on. So you dig into it further and we find out that summer heat stress happened and conception rate went down. And now in September, we got everybody pregnant. And then June, July, right now, we have heavy calving swings and our pen's overcrowded. And all of a sudden now we have more fresh cow problems. So was it a nutritional problem? No, it was more of a management, overcrowding, things that caused this stack stressor to become exacerbated. And now we're seeing the negative consequences of that, of more metritis, maybe a little more mastitis, some of those fresh cow issues. So understanding that those situations that can be indicative of inflammation, as you dive into the data a little more and hone into the why are we seeing what we're seeing, having an awareness and understanding of some of this is key, I think, and really helps. I've really had that help in identifying some of those.
So Megan, you mentioned before leaky gut. That term has come up in this conversation today, but let's really take a moment to define exactly what that is when we hear that term. What does that mean to you? What do you see?
Yeah, so Lance and Brady, we've been doing a good job of setting up why stress is important for gut health and why we've talked about how inflammation can stem from the gut when cows are in stressful situations. And a lot of that comes down to this thing that we call leaky gut. And when I'm talking to people about this, I kind of relate the gut epithelium to your skin. And just like your skin, that creates a barrier between you and the outside world, so too does your gut epithelium. And we all know your gut is a tube from your mouth to your anus, and everything that's inside of that tube is technically outside of your body. So when humans and animals are stressed, they receive stress signals are released from the brain, and they can bind to these cells in the gut called mast cells. And those mast cells can degranulate. And they basically release these compounds called proteases that cause the cells in your gut to separate. So normally those cells are creating a barrier between everything inside the gut. So all the microbes and the LPS and bacteria, et cetera, right? It creates a barrier. And then when that barrier becomes compromised, then those compounds can enter the bloodstream where they turn the immune system on. Right. So the reason that we reference stress, and in particular, I think about psychological stress a lot on these farms, is because they can cause a direct compromise with that gut barrier, creating this inflammation or inflamed state that we've been referring to all along. And so when I'm walking on farms, like Brady mentioned, I'm thinking about psychological stress quite a bit. And I like to joke that that's not because I'm a hippie that grew up in Colorado, right? Tree hugging hippie. It's because there's actually scientific data to indicate that psychological stress, both in humans and in animals, can cause this leaky gut phenomenon, turning the immune system on, ultimately taking energy away from production. So like Brady said, a lot of times that's stacked stressors, right? I'm looking a lot at cow comfort, which is king, cow comfort, and forage quality and feed hygiene when I'm on these herds. For example, if we've got a heating face of silage and there's probably some yeasts in the feed on top of feed not being pushed up frequently enough, so the cows have an element of psychological stress on top of some feed hygiene issues, which also can cause inflammation in the gut. Or we have a lot of foot health problems causing them to not get up and eat enough. There's another element of both rumen pH issues, but also some psychological stress there. Or there's a myriad of things that can be contributing to this psychologically stressed state. But I think it's the combination of several different small things that can ultimately lead to this hyperinflamed phenotype.
And so, Megan, as you explain that and you talk about those psychological stressors, it goes back to what you have been referring to as this stress stack. Brady and Dr. Baumgard, what else would you add to the stress stack? What are some of those factors that are going to make an animal more likely to be experiencing something like leaky gut or any other inflammatory response?
Yeah. So for me, the transition period, like I said, calving is one of those. It's going to be the largest stress event she's going to endure during her lactation. And then do we have overcrowding? Do we have poor feed management? Stall, cow comfort wise, things like that are all contributing factors to that stacked stressor, in my opinion. And then, other things, first lactation versus aged cows, and is there a dominance at the bunk? There's multiple things that can be limiting intake, and is it feed related or is it animal behavior and management related? So those things that can influence intake are really potentially exacerbating that inflammation and inflammatory response.
A couple more, Brady, that I think on farm that's potentially manageable is rough handling. And not only rough handling, but also noise. Have you ever notice oftentimes, frequently, not very productive farms are pretty mellow? And I think it goes even to the parlor. Sometimes the parlors are so loud, people shouting and screaming, and the compressor's so loud.
And the music.
Or loud, horrible music, To reiterate what Megan and Brady are saying, I just think there's so many things on farm that contribute to a cow being emotionally calm and unstressed. They all add up.
Yeah, I agree. And things you don't typically associate with emotional stress or inflammation, we know is a problem. Things like slippery concrete, cow feels like it's on ice all the time, or mixing first lactation cows with multiparous cows, for example. Yes, there's a dominance thing, but there's also an element of psychological disturbance in that scenario. And so there's just a lot of small things like Lance and Brady have also alluded to that you kind of have to get creative thinking about, because we don't have the data for a lot of these things. Some data in dairy that I've been interested in comes out of Proudfoot's lab, where she was looking at unpredictable feed environments and how that influences inflammation. And she's shown that if a dairy cow doesn't have predictable feed access, that can elevate some of these inflammatory markers we've been discussing as well. So cows love habit, they're habitual creatures. They like patterns, and they like to be fed at the same time every day, milked at the same time every day, and they like to do it calmly. So there's a lot of things that we have to go and walk through the farm and think, okay, is this disrupting my cow's normal time budget? And is there an easy or practical way, or maybe not so easy way, to address these things to ultimately get those last 2, 3, 5 pounds of milk?
As the three of you have been really just shining this much broader light on these root causes of inflammation and stress, and we've been getting really into the environmental factors, the hierarchy of the social status and dominance of cows within the herd, and just some of these little things within the environment that cause almost a psychological or an emotional stress impact. And these are conversations that are, I would almost call them a little bit new coming into our industry, to really accept that this is part of dairy farm management in today's world, is looking at these specific details. One thing that comes to mind that I would really love to hear from the three of you is, are there any specific examples or stories that you can share of a dairy that you worked with where you were diagnosing a problem? You were part of looking at maybe a transition cow problem or a leaky gut problem, and factors that ended up having an influence on improvement on getting those extra pounds of milk actually came down to some adjustments made to be able to lower environmental stress, psychological stress, as well as some of the stress factors coming in, as you said, from cow comfort, feed quality, and feed hygiene. What have you seen in real life when this is played out on farms that you work with?
So our team puts an emphasis on doing these feed fit assessments. So going on farm, making sure that we're fine tuning a lot of these practical management strategies that we can to make sure that cow is set up for success in the best way we know how. And one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time on lately is hanging bunk cameras up in the barn to make sure we're looking at how often is feed being pushed up. What do weighbacks look like overnight? How long are cows locked up in the headlocks? And anything else that might be influencing that cow's time budget over time. And so it's been interesting because you find a lot of different things on different farms. There's always something small. For example, like some farms with robot pushers, or those little push-up robots, you think that the job's getting done every 2 hours like it's programmed to do, and sometimes they get stuck and nobody really knows about it, and then they start working again 6 hours later and everyone's none the wiser, right? Or for example, a sorting pen is utilized at some point during the day and a gate's set up for X number of hours. And maybe cows still have access to feed, but now 10 feet of the bunk hasn't had any cows eating in it for who knows how many hours. And the next morning there's extra feed there, right? And then the feeders the next day lower how much feed the cows get for that day. And all of a sudden they run out of feed because there wasn't accounted for. So there's a lot of random things you can find with those bunk assessments that can help identify a lot of areas of opportunity with feed management on farms.
GPS Dairy Consulting goes beyond nutrition by offering tools and resources, broad multidisciplined experience, and a collaborative philosophy across a range of consulting services that will make your business more successful. How will GPS consultants do that? By collaborating with you and your team to solve challenges and create successes while achieving sustainable and profitable results, by fostering personal growth and leadership development, and by inspiring continuous change and improvement in your people, systems, and results. GPS Dairy Consulting LLC will go beyond nutrition to help you achieve your most challenging goals. Learn more and connect with a GPS consultant at gpsdairy.com. So, Megan, as you lay out some of those examples of where you've seen these areas that you've been able to identify through FeedFit, and where some error is occurring in the consistency of being able to deliver good, high quality feed as the cow expects it, I think oftentimes we tie those opportunities for improvement into feed management itself. But really, I think what the conversation today has expanded our minds to really consider is that every time that feed isn't getting pushed up, there is an impact on the cow psychologically that is going to impact her systemically and her ability to produce those extra few pounds of milk we keep talking about, or be able to maximize her components in her productive life. So, Brady, for you, where have you seen some of these examples show up in real life and possible areas to be able to tweak, to be able to really address these stressors and the inflammation that could be holding cows and farms back from achieving their ultimate success?
Yeah, there's a couple things that come to mind and areas to tweak. For me, I think one of the big ones is it's communication. And what I mean by that is communication between the feeders and the herdsman, the veterinarian, the nutritionist. So we're all in communication of what's going on farm. Sometimes I feel like there's still a little bit of a lack of communication in certain areas. So all of a sudden the herdsman's finding some more RPs or metritis or something's going on, and it's because the feeder hasn't relayed the fact that we're transitioning into a new bunk or we're transitioning forages. So it's one of those where, having that open communication of we're going to be transitioning feed. It's been raining a lot lately, and now there's more mud on the farm, and some of that mud gets tracked into feed. Just having that situational awareness. A lot of times we're really focused and we're really good at the job that we're doing, whether that's we're a feeder or we're a herdsman or wherever that might be, but having an awareness of everybody else's role, that how that influences your role. I think that's a huge area that I think is an area that farms can do better. And then I really strive to work with my clients on that to really make sure we open that communication up. And that's where some of those situations arise where, man, we had some HBSs flare up. And why could that be? Well, like I say, we're transitioning into a wetter pile of haylage, and we're on the ramp of that pile, or it's going to be raining here in Sioux Falls here today, and so there's going to be a lot more mud tomorrow. And having that communication open, I think, is key.
And I think that communication is key, and not assuming that everything is getting done, but actually checking, because sometimes things slip through the cracks despite everyone's best efforts. So I think that's a great point, Brady, that the whole team needs to be on board and all working towards a common goal.
And on that note, when you look at that entire team communication, I think that brings us back to some of the things that Dr. Baumgard was mentioning before, when you really look at areas around the dairy that can be causing stress. And I know one of the things you talked about was there's some slippery spots on the floor. Well, having everybody at the table, because someone who's pushing cows may see that spot that someone else might not. So, Dr. Baumgard, I'm going to turn it over to you to add to this conversation, as well as what are those things that we can do to be able to really identify these situations and bring some resolution to improve inflammation, stress, leaky gut, and all of the things that can come from those issues.
Yeah, just identifying where on the farm there's stressors. And that's why I think people like Brady and Megan provide so much value to a dairy farm, because they're on the farm. They can recognize all the way from the feeding center all the way to the maternity pen and to the parlor. So they recognize, okay, where these stressors are occurring and how do you cheaply implement strategies to prevent it. And just convincing producers to start realizing that there are the stress physiology that's costing them money, and investing here and there will probably pay big dividends.
The dream would be that at some point we create a life map of these cows, starting at birth. These heifers, are they getting the right amount of colostrum at the right time? How are they housed as calves? Are we doing lung ultrasounding? Are they transported out to Kansas? What type of environment did they grow up in? Were their mothers heat stressed? There's just so many different factors that can go into inflammation. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity in this particular field to like you asked, and like Lance and Brady have been alluding to identify where these stressors are coming from for each individual farm, because it is, quite frankly, going to be very different for every single farm. And so I think we need to get better at encompassing, or at seeing that cow as a lifetime of events, and then taking away the stressors where we can, because there's some inevitable ones, like giving birth is stressful. That's just going to be how it is, But there are things we can do to eliminate some of that. There's great research coming out showing how when the mom is heat stressed during the dry period, that her granddaughters can have less milk compared to dry cows that had cooling during the summertime. So there's just so many different areas where we have a lot of opportunity to continue to identify these stressors on farm.
I was just going to say, Megan, along those signs of research, question for you, Lance, this inflammation, and you talked about from your lab standpoint, it's been 10 years since you've gone back to the gut, which is in the academic world is a relatively new area of research. So what have been some of the most surprising insights or some of the new research on inflammation that you're seeing coming out right now in the last couple of years that have impacts to producers and dairy farmers?
I just constantly surprised how many stressors across different species, they all emanate from the gut. I think reinforces what we've been discussing today. For example, Brady and Megan, overcrowding. I've always wondered from a biology perspective, why does overcrowding cost milk? So they're unable to get to the bunk when they want to get there. Who cares if they have to wait an extra 30 minutes? Well, I think this whole idea that we've been discussing, stress-induced inflammation, can in large part probably explains why overcrowding costs producers money. I understand why, from an economics and a banking perspective, why people overcrowd. We all understand that, right? So I think this is also an exciting time, because if stress is emanating from the gut, and then presumably, maybe, hopefully, we can identify strategies, nutritional strategies to mitigate it. Obviously, we want to minimize stress management perspective, right? That's key. But if we're unable to totally eliminate stressors, and like you both mentioned, we probably never will be able to do that, then what are ways that we can intervene to mitigate it from a nutritional perspective? And I think there's where the real opportunities are. This concept of stress-induced leaky gut is not new, right? Every one of us on this podcast has probably been nervous or stressed at one point of their lives that causes either diarrhea or vomiting, or at least your stomach not feeling good. In fact, soldiers during the Civil War, when doctors were autopsying soldiers that died during combat, their stomach and intestines were riddled with visible signs of pathology, ulcers primarily. So my point here is that today we're talking about how stress affects the gut, but we've known about this for over 150 years. We're just now starting to crystallize how this happens in dairy cows.
And to just put this almost in a human health context, when we talk about stress management in humans, it comes back to building methods for resilience. And it's almost the same concept as I think what you're alluding to here is, how can we make the dairy cow more resilient to stress through nutritional aspects? And any research or anything that you see on the horizon nutritionally that you believe could be impactful in the next 5 years when it comes to just really being able to achieve that?
I'm going to start with the cop-out answer of, I think we should get the basics dialed in first, like Lance alluded to, right? Again, making sure that the TMR is the same for cow A at the bunk and cow Z at the bunk, making sure the mixer's in good shape, making sure that we have enough physically affected fiber, is hoof health good so the cow's not slug feeding, overcrowding, all of those things need to be in order. That's not to say there's not a time and a place for products. I think there's a lot of good data out there for different types of products that can help alleviate some of this inflammation. And I'm not going to throw just one or two out there, because I think there's a myriad in there. And again, every farm is different and the situation is different. So what's causing the inflammation? Is it a mycotoxin problem? Is it a feed hygiene issue? Because I'm going to use a different strategy for those farms than I would farms that are just dealing with more psychological stress. So I think there are products and tools that we can put in our tool belt to help address these issues, but they come with a cost. Some of these products are a little more expensive, and it might be better off to try to address the stress in the first place. But, we can't control if it's 100 degrees and the sprinklers are broken. There's, again, a time and a place for some of these intervention strategies. But at the end of the day, my answer is always going to be, let's try to fix the root of the problem rather than putting a Band-Aid on it.
I always talk to my clients about, I want you to be proactive, not reactive. So is there something that we can feed? And like Megan said, there is a plethora of feed additives that we can put into the diet that may or may not influence the gut integrity or gut health, but it's all situational. And what are we dealing with in terms of, like Megan said, the feed hygiene or the mycotoxin type stress? And so can we be proactive in, if we know we have a load of some sort, can we put something in there to help potentially stimulate more rumen digestion or better starch digestion in the rumen, or up regulating the gut integrity in terms of a trace mineral, for example, would be one situation. So I always talk to my clients about let's try and be proactive on that side of things. And that also stems from the same thing on the management side of things. Let's do our best instead of, hey, we have all of these things going bad. How do we react to these? And how can we fix these? And if we're at that point, we're 2 months down, we're 2 months late for this type thing. And so what should we have done? And how do we take this and learn from it? So how do we still have to react to the negative outcomes that we're seeing right now, but how do we learn from that so we can prevent that from happening in the future?
Yeah, Brady, that's all good points too. And, something that our team does well, like you said, is being proactive, not reactive. And for example, we have pre-harvest meetings so that we make sure our forage quality is set up the right way so that we're not feeding really dry or wet. And sometimes things happen, but we're not feeding butyric haylage because we sat down and everyone had a plan. Hopefully we're not, right? Again, things happen. But I think we've alluded to this concept of stack stressors a lot during this episode. Right. And I think that this is another opportunity to emphasize, like, if you have everything else set up right and a stressor that's inevitable that you can't control pops up, that cow is going to be able to handle that stressor a lot more than she would have if you also had all these other things going wrong. One example of this that I realized coming out of grad school, not everything's black and white. Like, we all know rumen acidosis is bad, right? High starch can cause rumen acidosis, which has bad outcomes for the cow. What I didn't recognize in grad school was just how important all the different factors on the farm were for deciding how much starch I was going to feed on that particular farm. So now when I'm walking herds and I'm looking at things like hoof health and things like cow comfort and overcrowding and forage quality, those are all going to play into how much starch I'm willing to push on that farm. And so it's really comes down to setting up the cow for success in the best ways that we can control. And then she's going to be able to handle some of those less avoidable stressors later.
So, question for you from a human health standpoint, I could pick up my phone right now and I could Google an entire list of foods that would cause or that are known inflammatory foods. So, with that question in mind, how does that pertain to the dairy cow? Are there known inflammatory foods, known inflammatory things that have maybe ended up in rations in different places, different regions, that we need to have an awareness that they can cause inflammation and not be contributing to reducing inflammation?
I don't know that I can think of a particular feed stuff. What I think it comes down to is how that feed stuff was managed. So things like the forage quality. Is the face of the silage pile heating up? Are there yeasts in there? Is there mycotoxins in there? Or are we driving a dirty skid loader right through the feed lane and now there's manure in the feed? There's a myriad of things that can cause feed to cause inflammation, but I don't know that it's necessarily the ingredient itself, but more so how it was handled and stored. And of course, like I alluded to earlier, right, it's about managing the pH in the rumen and managing not just pH, because there's a lot of different factors that cause a leaky gut with pH alterations, but it's making sure we're formulating the ration in a way that protects the rumen health of that cow. I'm excited about the future and how we can utilize technology to monitor some of these things. We talked about how it's pretty hard to go up to a cow and measure her inflammation, but more and more we're having these activity monitors and cameras that can watch body condition score and smart sprinklers that can turn on when the cow comes up to the gate to make sure she's cold, but we're saving water. I just think there's a lot of opportunity in that particular space to make up for where maybe communication can sometimes fail on farms. For example, one of the things I'm most excited about right now, or that I spend a lot of time thinking about, are these rumination monitors, these activity collars that can measure rumination, right? So we all know they flag at a certain point once the cow has dropped rumination at whatever particular threshold the collar is set for. But there's cool data that would indicate that rumination, even during the dry period, if it's the bottom third quadrant of the cows in the dry period relative to the rest of the herd, well, it might not be flagging the system. Those cows are typically the ones that have transition issues later. So how can we better utilize that data to help set us up for success, or at least identify the cows that we give an intervention? Or I think there's still a lot of unknown in that particular space, but I think technology is exciting, and I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space as well.
Well, Dr. Baumgard and Brady and Megan, you've each shared these perspectives today on this topic of stress management as well as inflammation, and brought it down to the on-farm level. And what I've heard to kind of summarize this conversation today is, number one is these things are real. They're happening from situational factors. They're happening from environmental stress, psychological stress. But really, a lot of it comes down to day-to-day management and just doing the right things right to take care of cows on a daily basis, having an open communication with the team, focusing on the feed hygiene, on push-ups, on doing all of those things right. And then potentially looking at what are those extra little triggers that we can pull to really optimize production and performance of the cow. But that comes secondary to doing things right in the first place. And so I'm going to invite the three of you to each share a final thought on this conversation today. Really, your key takeaway that you hope our listeners of dairy producers and others out there that touch dairy producers as professionals in the industry, that they keep in mind when we talk about stress, inflammation, and the impacts that has on the cow.
Yeah, I think one thing that you can take away from this is making sure that those lines of communication are open. Is everybody aware of each other's role on the farm and the impact that the feeder has on the herdsman? And is the night guy, there's feed not distributed properly, and so they move that to a different pen? And is the feeder aware of that? So just making sure that communication's open to understand the impact that has on some stressful situations for cows, and making sure that everybody's aware of that.
Megan, your final thoughts as we wrap up our conversation today.
I want producers to know, like Brady said, communication is super important, and it's often a lot of small things that are adding up to that last 2, 3, 4 pounds of milk, whatever you're shooting for. I want people to know that stress can cause inflammation, and that inflammation is really expensive. Those are the two simple concepts I want you to walk away from, and then recognize that there's probably some small things you can tweak to alleviate that inflammation and stress load on the cows.
I would just, I guess, reiterate and echo what Drs. Goetz and Abeyta just mentioned, right? Is recognizing that stress costs you money, and having a consultant that's aware of this, for one, is important. And then two, how these consultants can help you identify where and when to mitigate. I think that's really important.
Well, thank you three for sharing your knowledge and wisdom on this topic today. And what I'm taking away from this conversation as well, from the three of you, is we can't always see inflammation from the outside of the cow. We can't look at the cow and see it. But what we can do is rely on those people on our team and the people that we trust to come in with those outside eyes and to see what we don't see that's going on around the cow that's influencing what's going on inside of her. And that's this inflammation that is real and present, but just hard to sometimes see from the outside. Well, with that, thank you to all three of you for joining us for this GPS DairyCast. For those that are listening, we are in the heat of summer by now, and this topic is going to be one that you're probably dealing with on your dairy, so make sure you get a hold of your GPS consultant for some help with those extra set of eyes and hands to be able to see what you may not be able to see every day within your herd to optimize performance, production, and be successful as a dairy farmer in this business today. Thank you to the three of you for joining us on the GPS DairyCast.
The GPS DairyCast features conversations that deliver on the GPS Dairy Consulting promise to inspire change and grow leaders. If this GPS DairyCast has you looking for more ways to become an elite dairy producer, find more information in our show notes on how you can add a GPS advisor to your team.